for fears. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. This is Breaking with Convention, War, Peace, and the Presidency. We're broadcasting this week and next week an expanded 2-hour Democracy Now! Each weekday. This week from Cleveland, next week from Philadelphia, where the Democratic Convention will take place. I'm Amy Goodman. During his nomination speech here in Cleveland, Donald Trump referred to former Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders.
I have seen firsthand how the system is rigged against our citizens, just like it was rigged against Bernie Sanders. He never had a chance, never had a chance. But his supporters will join our movement because we will fix his biggest single issue, trade deals that strip our country of its jobs and strip us of our wealth as a country. Millions of Democrats will join our movement because we are going to fix the system so it works fairly and justly for each and every American.
That is Donald Trump and his acceptance of the Republican nomination as presidential candidate last night at the Quicken Loans Arena. David K. Johnston, our guest, the author of Making of Donald Trump, Vince Warren, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Jamil Smith, Cleveland native and also works with MTV News. David K. Johnston, what he was doing here, Donald Trump, and appealing to Bernie Sanders voters, and what his record is on dealing with the economy and business.
Well, I find it hard to believe very many people who supported Bernie Sanders are going to go over to Donald. The demographic data shows the dividing line here is basically race. Donald's whole campaign, as Vince and Jamila pointed out, is built around racism and not deeply coded texts of racism. The people who are supporting Bernie Sanders share the same economic concerns and legitimately share them because our policies have really hurt the bottom 90% of Americans in the last 36 years. But those are not people who are going to be drawn in by Donald's fear-mongering, Donald's blatant appeals to racism, his bigotry against Muslims and others. That's not the Bernie Sanders crowd. Those people may stay home, but I can't see very many of them joining Donald.
Many commentators have compared Trump's speech to the one given by Richard Nixon at the 1968 Republican National Convention.
Cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. We see Americans dying on distant battlefields abroad. We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. And as we see and hear these things, millions of Americans cry out in anguish. Did we come all this way for this?
That was Richard Nixon, 1968 Republican National Convention. Vince Warren, do you see similarities?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you played that clip because there are tremendous similarities not only in the contents of the speech but also in the context of the times. Richard Nixon, of course, came in as a law and order candidate looking at the same demographic and making the same arguments, which is that the nation is under siege, there's all of this crime that's happening. Now, of course, what he didn't talk about was that all of the protests that were happening were protesting unjust wars abroad, protesting unjust treatment of black people here, protesting police brutality and authoritarianism. It's the same type of context that we have today. And of course, Donald Trump in his speech didn't point that out either. When he was talking about crime and law and order, he was talking about killing of police officers, but of course he wasn't talking about police officers killing black people. And Donald Trump and I think Richard Nixon create the hero-victim narrative for law enforcement. The heroes that, they create a scenario where things are so bad that the only people that can swoop in are law enforcement, but the poor protesters are villainizing and making their job so much harder to do. An attack on a police is an attack on America. What we also need to hear, and we didn't hear it from Nixon and we certainly aren't hearing it from Trump, is that if police officers are killing black people, What is that an attack on? And of course, that's why we have so much protest and righteous protest right now, because it's terrible what's happening to communities of color. That's what the reaction is. And both Trump and Nixon were looking to clamp down and convert that into some sort of crazy chaos that needed to be controlled.
Jamil Smith, take off where Vince Warren just was speaking, and also talk about your hometown of Cleveland as a kind of microcosm of what's happening in this country.
Well, you remember there's a token mention of cities, Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, cities that have been plagued by not just racial unrest, but also police violence against black people. So there was a mention of them and sort of, that could come off as sensitive, but he wasn't talking to the citizens of Ferguson, Chicago, and Baltimore who are dealing with these issues, not only the violence, but also the poverty. He was talking about them. And it really served to separate those audiences from the Americans to whom he was presumably directing his speech. Now, that is a good way to erase whoever you don't need in the fall. And so when I think about this convention happening here in Cleveland, my father and my uncle working part-time at that arena, I ran into my uncle on the way out of the arena last night. He asked me, what did I get from Trump's speech? He hadn't heard it. He was outside. And I said, a deep sense of dread, because here was a speech in our hometown that didn't even recognize the realities of the hometown, and especially for the majority black population here.
Cleveland is the most distressed city in the country.
One of them, yes.
One of the most segregated cities in the country.
Certainly.
How do you think Trump's policies, or perhaps Clinton's policies, could address this city?
Well, I think certainly Trump's policies would appeal to a certain segment of the folks that live here. Or certainly on the west side, it could be a petri dish for Trumpism. I mean, you have working class whites in a majority black city who may or may not have grievances about what's going on. So I certainly think it could appeal to a certain segment of our population here, but I think Clinton's approach, I think, is a lot more productive. She is trying to engage white people in the conversation about racial justice and about social justice. So I think you're seeing response to that in Cleveland. You saw in protest this week a very diverse crowd of people calling for, adjustment on, with regards to poverty, with regards to housing discrimination, all the things that, we're still suffering from here from the 2008 housing crisis. We need better policies to help cities rise out of that. We don't need the citizens scapegoated for the purposes of bringing a strong man to power.
David K. Johnston, you've written a number of articles very recently. One of them, Donald Trump and kids named in $250 million tax scam. The next, the Republicans' Commie Convention Hotel. And Mike Pence and Donald Trump's gospel of corporate welfare. Go through them quickly.
Well, the corporate welfare one is that Mike Pence cut off food stamps to adults, even though there are 5 times as many people looking for jobs in Indiana as jobs available. Yet he promotes his Christian charity, and he's given away more than $800 million to corporations, taxing the average family more than $100 a year. That strikes me as corporate socialism, and I think he's a true blue corporate socialist, as is Donald. The Commie Hotel, the main hotel for the convention, the Hilton, no company would invest there. So the taxpayers were forced to build this hotel. It's going to fail eventually as a business enterprise. Here we have the party of free enterprise meeting in a hotel that any of them, if it was elsewhere in the world, would call state-owned if they're diplomatic, or they'd call a commie hotel if they're Trumpian Republicans. I'm sorry, what was the first one you asked me about, Amy?
The other piece that you wrote recently, Donald Trump and kids named in $250 million tax scam.
Yes. They are not defendants in this. They are, at the moment, material witnesses. But Donald has been sued over a number of developments for civil fraud. He settled some of the cases. Some of them are still ongoing. This lawsuit is a private, on behalf of the public lawsuit called a QTAM suit that alleges a $250 million tax scam by a guy Donald worked very closely with, traveled all over the country with, trying to do real estate deals, and who it's alleged evaded taxes. Now, it hasn't been settled. It's a state-level case in New York, but Donald and Ivanka and Donald Jr. are all clearly material witnesses in what the lawsuit asserts is a scam to evade taxes. And I've written other columns about Donald and his taxes, including a tax return filed on his behalf, a photocopy apparently that was filed, where his own tax guy said, well, that's my signature, but I didn't prepare that tax return.
Final comment, Vince Warren.
I think looking at the Trump speech, that he sees America's problem as people of color and communities of color. He pits communities of color against each other to further that narrative. He talks about the poor victimized, law enforcement to strengthen that up. And essentially, he's looking to strengthen law enforcement to protect white America from communities of color and to protect communities of color from victimizing themselves. This is going to be known as the Gotham City speech. It's dark, it's dire, and we are looking at the emergence of a new security state in the U.S. because although this has been happening under the Obama and the Bush era, it's been a ratchet up. The ratchet here with Donald Trump is that it's going to catch fire very quickly, and you know that's really what this speech was about domestically, from my perspective.
Jamil Smith, are you headed to Philadelphia?
Yes, I am. I'll be there tomorrow, and I'm looking for hopefully a little bit more hopeful vision for America with some actual steps to achieve it.
We're going to leave it there. I want to thank Jamil Smith of MTV and Vince Warren of the Center for Constitutional Rights and the author of the new book, David K. Johnston, whose book is coming out next week on the making of Donald Trump.